Well, I can't believe that we are already on to the United Kingdom stage. If you remember, we were going through the basic stages in the Book of Ages, that collection of stages that Harold Wilmington put together. And we have been through the creation stage and the patriarchs, the patriarchal stage, and we saw Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Then we went on and we saw Moses lead his people out of Egypt, then Joshua leading them into the promised land in the conquest stage. And then we just came out of the judges stage and we saw the sort of dismal aspects of what it means when everybody does what is right in their own eyes. And so now we're heading into the United Kingdom stage. Let's talk a little bit about the failure of the judges stage as we get started. There was that mantra, that motto for the time: every man did what was right in his own eyes, and that turned out to be a bad thing, because those decisions that we made were all selfishly and not informed by Scripture or by a desire for good morality. Just did what was right pragmatically in our own eyes, and that was a mantra that is recorded in the book of Judges that God would not have approved of. So that's part of the failure. Also, Eli, his sons were wicked and were killed, and so the family that was associated with the tabernacle did not seem to produce good leadership. And Samuel's sons also fell into that category of disobeying God and not following what God dictated. And so the people didn't find leadership and comfort and security in any of Samuel's family either. As well, to be honest, the times are unstable because people's trust in God was not consistent. If you remember that cycle of sin, they would be overconfident, they would wander in idolatry, and then they would fall into captivity and then have to be delivered. And those things were inherently unstable, not because God was not in charge, but because the people's trust in God was not consistent. They were wayward too often, and so it made a mess of their own lives. And then finally, they had a desire. They're looking around and looking at the other nations that have a king, and they decide, we would like to have a king too. And nobody is better than a warrior king who can fight your battles for you, somebody who, as we'll see in a minute, is head and shoulders above everybody else. So the judges stage was a failure in terms of its ability to produce a good, stable civilization for the Israelites. And so something else they began to clamor for. All right. The people begin, as we note in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people begin to desire a king. And they clamor for it, and Samuel is dejected because he thinks they're rejecting him, and God says this: obey the voice of the people in all that they have. God tells him this: obey the voice of the people in all they have that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. So in God's view, he was the king during the judges stage, and the people, because they were inconsistent in following God, it made that stage unstable. The problem with the king, Samuel said, is that he will take your sons and your wealth. He will take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, 10% of your profit. Kings can be costly, as he would lay out for the people of Israel, but nevertheless, the people would continue to desire a king who would go in and out and fight their battles for them. So as we discuss the United Kingdom stage, we're talking about the very first king, Saul, and how the people began to gather around first Saul and then David and then finally Solomon, and how the tribes began to pull together as a nation. There was always a bit of a integration problem between the tribes, and so they easily split in two after Solomon's reign when we discussed the divided kingdom stage, or as Dr. Wilmington called it, the chaotic kingdom stage. But they divide easily because the tribes have natural groupings together in north and south, and who's allied with who. And so, but David is able to overcome, and Solomon, of course, is the pinnacle of Jewish power and influence in the Promised Land and in the surrounding nations. So the United Kingdom stage is the best of all possible worlds under David and especially under Solomon. And we'll see how their kingdoms laid out. But the tribes pull together in building this nation. Deuteronomy 17 outlines the duties of a king. And it's interesting, this is Moses writing, so it's before this time. So God had already been laying out for them the role of a king, what the duties of that king might be. And so it was not out of God's mind or God's, plan B because the people were clamoring. It was his plan, but it's the clamor of the people that makes the desire for a king a sin, and not just following God until he's ready to bring a king. Deuteronomy 17 says, here's the duties of a king. If you're going to choose a king, it says you have to choose a brother among you, somebody who knows your culture, knows God, not a foreigner, however talented or skilled, because they may not have the same internal value system, especially in choosing to follow God. So choose a brother among you. And then this king has the duty not to acquire many horses or build up incredible military power in his own strength. He must not take many wives, Deuteronomy says, and at that point in time in that culture, wives were political alliances with other kings. And so don't take many wives. He shall not acquire excessive amounts of silver and gold, become rich off the backs of his people. And then finally, he was responsible for writing out a copy of the law of God for himself. So we at least knew the king had knowledge of the word of God for himself because he wrote out a copy of it for himself, and that made him accountable to it, was the plan. All right, so in the United Kingdom, we have three kings. The first one is Saul, second one is David, third one is David's son Solomon. So we'll take them each in turn and just point out a couple of things, and then later we'll have perhaps more lectures on the kingship of David or of Solomon. So Saul is anointed king. He's marked out as king by the prophet. Watch how the offices of prophet and king relate to each other. There are three offices which are anointed: prophet, priest, and king. And Saul is anointed by a prophet to be fitting in the role of king. Saul fits that outward appearance characteristic. We need somebody who's going to fight our battles for us, and nobody's better than the biggest and tallest, the one who is head and shoulders taller than everybody else. During Saul's reign, we begin to read more and more. The Philistines were introduced to us in Judges, but we read more and more of our battles in the Holy Land between the Israelites and the Philistines. And so the Philistines, we'll talk about them a little later. They're not Canaanites. They also are immigrating into the Holy Land area. We'll see as you read through the biography of Saul that Saul's not above a little kingly manipulation, even in trying to do away with an enemy like David by offering his own daughter in the process. So he's not above manipulation, and in his disobedience finally, God turns him, God rejects him from being king, and another king is anointed. This leads to a problem of two anointed kings in Israel, as we'll see how that plays out, because this person is not someone that you would look at from the outward appearance and say, this man is a king. But this time, God chooses a king who will be a man after God's own heart. And so David is chosen. David's family line is important. His sister is Zeruiah, and so he will have Joab and other of his relatives in his administration. And then, of course, the ultimate is David's family tree reaches into the life of Solomon and then on to the life of Christ. David is responsible for unifying tribes. You'll notice that he becomes king first over a limited number of tribes at Hebron, and then later he will become king over all of Israel as he's pulling those tribes together under his kingship. And then David's the one who's responsible for temple preparation. It was David's idea to build a temple, and God said, no, David, because you are a bloody man, I will give the task of building a home for me to your son. But David spent a good share of his kingship putting together gold and silver and wood and cedar and all of the things that you needed so that Solomon had those things at his disposal when it came time to build the temple of God. Another thing that's interesting is, if you remember one of the last stories that we have in David's life, it has to do with David desiring a census, which is, again, it's trying to look at the military strength of the nation from a secular perspective without regard to what God could do in military conflict, which was Joab's objection to the census. But David had the census anyway, and as a result, he was judged with a choice of judgments. And the judgment that he chose was 3 days of the death angel going through Israel and killing and judging God's people. And David met that angel in the text on the threshing floor of Arunah. And he ends up buying the threshing floor from Arunah, having a sacrifice, and the death angel's judgment then is stayed at that threshing floor. What's interesting about this threshing floor is it's exactly where Solomon then decides to build the temple, which is where the judgment of God is stopped. Our sin is judged on the sacrifices and ultimately the sacrifice of Christ. So the threshing floor of Arunah is where judgment is stopped. And that's a great picture of what the temple would set out to do. So the first king is Saul, second king is David, third king is Solomon then, David's son. God makes him the wisest, makes him the most prosperous. And so in his administrative genius, he is able to make Israel a world-shaking empire. He controls things and he makes things happen. People travel from all over in order to seek an audience with Solomon for purposes of trade, for purposes of security. And so Solomon is aided by God to administer the kingdom with great skill. He's also the one that will have taken everything that David has prepared, all the plans that David has prepared, all the stuff that he set aside. Solomon will add his own stuff, and he will construct and dedicate the temple in the early part of his reign. Solomon is also a genius when we get to making a video and you get a chance to see next week all that Solomon accomplished. You'll see the books of the Bible are just the beginning. He wrote out Proverbs, he wrote out great scientific observations um, of plants and animals and all of the rest. So Solomon wrote Psalm 45. He wrote the book of Proverbs, except for later on some other things that were added. He wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. He is the hand and glove using the name the preacher. And then Solomon wrote the Song of Solomon, and I look forward to talking with you about that book as well. So Solomon is the pinnacle of literary influence, the pinnacle of scientific advance. This is an incredible time to be living, as witnessed to by none other than the Queen of Sheba, as you'll read. So those are our kings in the United Kingdom stage. Solomon's son will cause the division, and from then on, God's people live in two separate nations, often in conflict with each other. And so this is sort of the short-lived time in which God's people were united, they were prosperous, and they were at peace under Solomon's reign. What's important about one of the things that made Solomon so able to prosper was that the King's Highway between Babylon and Assyria and Egypt travels right through Israel. It's why there's war there all the time. Is everybody wants to control that area because they want to control the trade routes back and forth. So they're the first people to see what merchants are bringing through, the first people to see new and exotic goods, and they can tax everything that goes through their land. So you can see this would have made an incredible difference in Solomon's ability, if he has the ability to hold on to the land, to make that land become rich because of all the trade that wants to pass through there between one nation and another. So Solomon has incredible influence internationally. We'll talk when we get to talking about wisdom a little bit. Wisdom is international in flavor. It stretches out so that people everywhere can understand what is good and true and beautiful, and they find in what Solomon is doing all of those things. So incredible achievements that Solomon lays out. And I hope before we pass out of the United Kingdom stage, we will have looked at some of those things that are happening. Keep in mind, this is a couple hundred years before Homer. This is before the Greek civilization really gets started, or Rome. This is Israel's day in the sun. And so it will be fun to kind of walk through some of the things that happened in the United Kingdom stage. Thanks for listening.